Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. And you get special kudos for making it on time. I know with everybody's busy schedules, that's like a feat in itself. Just before we jump in, let me quickly introduce myself and Instawork. I'm Frances Liu. I lead marketing here. For those who don't know, Instawork is a flexible staffing solution for warehouse and distribution, and we work with a lot of fast-growing brands like yourself. Unlike traditional staffing agencies, we use technology to improve the accountability and provide stronger incentives and rewards for the professionals that work on our platform, so they continue working with us, with our business clients, etc. And it's been especially interesting in this current labor environment because we have our customers tell us that we're still providing them considerable support. And even just last month, we still have 40,000 people who sign up. We're in over 25 metro areas and we're growing. That's all sort of about Instawork now. We started hosting these sessions really because we heard from our customers and those in the industry that there's just so much going on, and it's really hard to really understand what's happening in the environment, really learn from each other. And so started these series earlier this year, continue to grow. They've been really fruitful. And so I'm really excited to have Bill come online. Many of you guys submitted questions, and there were so many that we were actually able to incorporate much of them into themes. So a lot of it will be addressing many of the things that you guys were top of mind. But we'll still have a ton of time to answer your questions that come up throughout the way. So feel free to chat them, raise your hand, do whatever feels comfortable for you. And I hope that this would be both a fruitful conversation, but also a dialogue amongst those who are attending and with Bill as well. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to the star of the show. Bill, do you mind introducing a little bit about yourself, your current responsibilities at Herbivore Botanicals?
Okay, sure. Well, thanks, and thanks to everyone for joining. I hope we can make this a good discussion. I think it will be. Before I introduce myself, and I promise not to spend very long with that, but for those of you in logistics, operations, distribution, even customer experience, making this decision on insource, outsource, how do you manage this whole thing is probably the most important decision that you will ever have to make. And if it's done right, you'll be a hero. If it's not done right, it can sometimes go the other direction. But it's really important, and I think it's important to understand all the factors that come into making this decision. And there are a bunch of them. And a lot of times people don't understand all the factors and really appreciate the trade-offs that go into this type of decision. So hopefully in our discussion today, we can go through that and cover some of those points. And by the way, I tend to be kind of an expert at this because I've made every mistake you can possibly make. So there's nothing you've done or experienced that I haven't also experienced. So I can quite often tell you what definitely not to do because I've unfortunately have done it in my past in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, I'm currently the SVP of Operations and Supply Chain with Herbivore Botanicals. I oversee all. Just what I described, all the supply chain and distribution for a relatively young skincare brand, healthy, vegan, sustainable, just an absolute great brand. But we're growing rapidly. Like we're actually seeing like 65% growth year over year. Even though last year was not the best year in the world for all of us, it's certainly we're growing rapidly this year. And if you look at my background, I've actually been with a number of beauty brands. And, I sort of started at some point in my career gravitating toward younger startup brands because I find that to be a very exciting time in the growth and the evolution of a brand. So I guess you could call it a sickness, I suppose, but I gravitate toward that just from this. It can, as you may well know, it can be a very chaotic time joining a younger, rapidly growing brand because there's just so many moving parts and you're having to wear a lot of different hats. But it's fun to be part of that if you're that kind of person that enjoys that sort of thing. But I've worked in a lot of different industries as far as, when it comes to logistics, high cube, low cube. I was with Restoration Hardware for a number of years, which, has its own challenges because everything you're moving around is gigantic and usually in a box of some sort. I was with Ralph Lauren for a number of years, so I have a pretty strong apparel background. And then with CPG companies like The Honest Company and Bare Essentials, Bare Minerals, Shiseido, and a number of smaller cosmetic brands over the years. So I've kind of, had a mix of background there that kind of covers all the bases when you look at warehousing, distribution, and so on. So with that, should we maybe...
We'll jump right into it. And so for those who just joined, we're going to start jumping into a few questions. A lot of them are the ones that you've submitted. And I've themed it up. I think, one, there were some questions around projections, because that's really where you start, right? When you're thinking about how do you decide what you want to do next. Then a lot of questions around like the factors you considered, things that Bill, you mentioned around what are the trade-offs. And then the third, I think, is just like really how do you put into practice, right? Because it's all fun and games, when it's theoretical, but like once you're executing, what are the things that they should really consider? And so maybe just to start with the projections, when we were talking, it's sort of known you need to have a solid projection, but really, what does that look like? What are the top 3 pieces of information or things that you look at to feel confident to build like a forecasting model?
Yes, as we start to dig into some of the the factors that come to play in making this decision, there's a variety, and I hope we should be able to cover them all. But when you're at a point where you're trying to make that decision, okay, we're growing, our model is changing, maybe we're adding channels, maybe we're adding new products, but we're growing, and we know that what we currently have will probably not meet our needs in the next year, maybe in the next 6 months, or certainly over a longer period of time. So it's time to make that decision and kind of go through the process of gathering all the data and all the information you need to be able to make a smart decision. And there's several of those. One, even things like the customer experience, you want to really understand what you want from a customer experience as far as products that you're shipping, be it direct to consumer, wholesale, whatever that be. But another factor that really comes into play is, in fact, a forecast or a long range revenue plan to understand, by your individual categories or the products you carry, what's a longer term. When I say longer term, you really want to know 2 and 3 years out where the growth is and in what categories and even what geographies, because a lot of times if you're going to outsource or you're going to do your own, the location of that facility is absolutely critical, because you can minimize transportation costs if you have your facility in the right place. In fact, you may make decisions to have multiple facilities because that's really what you need to have your inventory in the right geographic location. So you might make decisions, hey, we really need 3 facilities in order to best meet the needs of our customers. So those all come into play. But yeah, it's really important that you have that long range revenue forecast, because that's a critical element when you're looking out 2 and 3 years. Because see, when you do a project like this, you don't want to do this every 6 months or every year. You'd really like to be able to, if you're going to commit to either doing, especially if you're going to do your own building, that is a massive commitment. And there's all kinds of implications that come with doing your own building. But you really need to, and one of those is size. And as good as you are at determining the size of your new facility, or you're enlarging or adding on, whatever that may be, take it from me, I've done this so many times, you're never going to get it exactly right. It's either going to be too small or too big to some extent. And that just kind of comes with that type of decisions. Now, the trade-off, is if it's too small, then all of a sudden you have capacity issues. You don't have enough space to just run your business, or to pick your orders, or even warehouse your inventory to support your customer base. So in those cases, there are options to offset that. Like you could do some offsite storage, and maybe if seasonality really comes into play, you can use a temporary offsite storage to support your business. If it's too large, that's a bigger problem. And of course, your finance team is always going to be saying, hey, we're paying a lot of rent here for space that's just sitting there empty. And actually, there's options, there's options now that weren't there a few years ago. Like there's several companies out there like Flex and Flow Space that actually work with customers to say, hey, if you've got an extra 5,000 square feet of storage space, partner with us and we'll find ways to sublease that space. And it's not a formal sublease, it's actually just a month by month type of way that you can utilize that space. So there are options if you do find yourself with a big chunk of empty space, and maybe it's empty for 8 months out of the year and then you use it for peak periods. So there's options to please the finance team as far as getting a little bit of revenue for that space instead of just sitting there where they're paying the rent each month. I'd like to touch a little bit on customer experience because this is really a critical factor in this whole thing. And in fact, I would encourage all of you, if you're either leading or participating in a project like this, is to kind of look at the customer experience and work backwards. For example, I've worked with beauty brands, and obviously with skincare, cosmetics, branding is everything. I mean, it impacts every part of your business. I mean, here I am a guy that I don't use our products, but I'm not really, I'm familiar with how they're used and that sort of thing. So from a branding standpoint, sometimes it's a little difficult for me to put myself in the shoes of a customer to really understand that. So that's where it's important that I partner with our marketing team and our sales team to get their feedback when we're trying to make a decision on the customer experience. But if you're direct to consumer, the challenge is just figuring out what that final delivery to your customer, when they get their package, their carton, their envelope, whatever it is that you're shipping to them, what do you want that to look like? And in the beauty industry, you almost want it to look like a present, like the customer's getting this gift, and to make it just an absolute wonderful experience. And of course, on the more practical side with us ops guys, a lot of times it's like, how do we protect whatever we're shipping to our customer so that when they open this nice present, there's not broken glass with stuff leaking everywhere? That's just absolutely horrible experience for the customer. So there's a mix there. And then of course, if your brand is, if sustainability is a big part of your brand message, then that you have to engineer and really build into your customer experience. And in fact, for example, if we were strictly worrying about protecting our products like us ops people like to do, we'd wrap our glass bottles in bubble wrap and put plastic tape. Well, from a branding experience and certainly from sustainability, that's an absolute horrible no-no. You can't, in most brands, and it's gravitating that even more so, you can't use plastic. Plastic is just from a customer experience and a customer expectation, when they buy into a brand and believe in a brand, they want to be part of that brand culture. And no plastic. I've even used recyclable or sustainable type air pillows. And the problem with that is, even though the air pillow is a very sustainable type of thing, it looks like plastic. So sometimes your customers, we've gotten we use really sustainable and recyclable air pillows, but customers would say, we don't want plastics in our cartons. And it's like, you can't really win an argument with the customer and say, well, it's not really plastic, but nevertheless, it's the perception that quite often you're dealing with. So we've had to go other directions, and quite often it's just using, paper or paper products, tissue and that sort of thing. But a lot of it is, what do you want it to look like? I mean, currently we're looking at using like a geometry that we will wrap our products in to kind of give it that void fill and that protection. And then we wrap it in tissue, and then we put a little sticker on it. We use, water activated tape. We use, a branded type of corrugate shipper and that sort of thing. So that's a rather elaborate type of pack out. And the only reason I'm spending so much time talking about what are you going to prepare for the customer is, if that customer presentation is pretty complex, pretty complicated, then you may have a hard time finding a 3PL that will really understand that, grasp that, and be able to do it. Because one thing you have to keep in mind with 3PLs is they try to be jacks of all trades. I mean, that's the only way they make money. They can't really build highly customized solutions for each of their customers, because if you're in a facility, you're probably in a facility with many customers, and they tend to have pretty generic type of offerings that they present to everyone. So if you're looking for a highly customized type solution, it might be better just to say, hey, I think we should do this ourselves, because it's the only way we'll get the quality and be able to really give our customers that special type of experience that only an in-house operation could do. And that can include flexibility with, inserting marketing materials or gift wrapping, or, any type of value-added service that you may do, inserting cards with the CEO's message, and, just all those things that go on. Now, 3PLs can do a lot of that, but it's not nearly as easy to control. And quite often, when you have projects like that, 3PLs will say, well, yes, we can do that, but we need to do a price change request, and it's probably going to take us a month or two to go through the entire process of getting that all set up and achieved. And quite often, you don't have that much lead time to be able to make those types of decisions. So that certainly comes into play. So I think, customer experience is critically important. And every place I've ever been, I mean, I tend to gravitate more toward premium brands where it's probably more important. But certainly, I think any CPG company or any industry who ships direct to customer would really need to take that into consideration.
No, I think that's a really great point. So I think you kind of started talking about some of the forecasting considerations, which is categories, right? What's the macro trend? Where is it going? Geography, where are you really want to selling to? Because I think that really matters. Look, and I think the customer experience is huge, and I really appreciate you sort of expanding on that, because it does really probably even figure into your forecast too. I want to dig in more on that customer experience a little bit more, but before maybe jumping into that, in your forecast, that 2 to 3 year long view, that's great. How do you do that in a startup where it probably, and especially in this environment where like it might be a little bit more uncertain? Like, do you have a point of view of then, do you lean one way or another, or do you create more contingency plans? Like what's your perspective? Like, how do you sort of manage through a time period where maybe you can't do, or you don't have a lot of confidence in your long-term forecast?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And thanks for bringing me back to that. The interesting thing with startups is, again, it's rapidly growing and it's a fun time, but it is definitely very uncertain. And I always ask the question, us ops people have to be a little paranoid by nature and always wondering, what can go wrong. That's the world we live in, unfortunately. But yeah, whenever you're making that decision, certainly you have to work with sales, marketing, finance, with the entire team to get a consensus on, okay, what is our revenue plan for next year and the year after? How big is big? And to understand that, by channel, by product, not just in total. So that is really an important consideration. But, for younger brands, because of the high level of uncertainty with a forecast, like if you're a 20 to 40 to even maybe $80 million company, you're still living in a world where your future is uncertain. You're rapidly growing, things are changing rapidly, but there's a great deal of uncertainty. So I would almost encourage anyone with a young company like that, you almost have to leverage a 3PL in order to be able to do that. Because the one thing they offer is they offer flexible space. If your forecast is low, they can add on space with very little short notice, and you've added capacity immediately. If you're under, then you didn't commit to a big space that you're sitting there and not using. So those are the factors. And quite often, what I've done many times is when we were smaller and younger, we worked with 3PLs. But as we got larger and we got more predictable with our forecast, our business became more mature. Our growth wasn't as high, but it was still pretty rapid growth. At that point, we usually made decisions to bring our distribution operation in-house, because we found we could do, we could do it just much better from a quality and a customer experience standpoint, and quite often even do it cheaper. So that's typically how companies will do that. And at that point, you're pretty certain of how much square footage you need, and you can even add levels. You can start adding levels of automation as you do your own facility, which bring down cost and just add capacity and speed to an existing building. And another big part of this is just the amount of inventory you have. Young companies with a very unpredictable forecast, your inventory levels can fluctuate. You can go, if your sales far exceed your forecast, then you may be experiencing out of stocks, your inventory levels are low, and you don't need as much space. But then on the other hand, if maybe your forecasting is not as good on the other side, then you may have large pockets of inventory that aren't moving as fast as what you expected, which takes up a lot of space, especially if it's higher cube type items, can eat up a ton of space. So the box you're in can expand and contract depending upon your inventory situation. If your turns are higher, then that's a good thing from a space standpoint, but maybe not so much from a customer experience standpoint as far as being in stock. If your turns are really low, then that's good from a customer standpoint because you probably have the inventory to ship, but then it takes up a ton of space. And I mean, just to use a kind of an industry example, if you double your turn, you can run your business in half the space. So, it's really that big. Like I've had facilities that were 1 million square feet. And when you look at 1 million square feet, you double your turn, you can now run that in 500,000. That's a big deal. 500,000 square feet of excess space is a big deal and a massive expense that the company just can't afford to do. So yeah, a forecast is really, in fact, the forecast is really the one thing that obviously drives your decision. And it's something that must be a consensus. I mean, you never want to be the guy who's making the decision based on, what you think the forecast is. It truly has to be a joint decision with finance, marketing, and sales, where you all hold hands and you say, okay, we're agreeing to this forecast and we're going to move forward with our plan, knowing that, this type of project takes a lot of time and you're making a commitment for the next couple of years. Like I said, you can't change your mind every few months because you've got commitments. You're doing it yourself. You're actually acquiring either real estate or you're leasing a building, you're signing contracts. It's not easy to get out of some of those contractual obligations, but yeah, forecast is certainly a critical part of that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Before we move on to a lot more of the factors to consider, around customer experience or other nuances of the business, does anybody have questions around the forecasting and planning and projections part of the conversation? Anything we want to go deeper on? Okay. In the interest of time, we'll continue on. I think you really highlighted the complexity and like the customer experience that end into as a factor that companies should consider. You've also, I thought, was really interesting in that you're like, you work with a high brand, with like a premium brand. They have a ton of you. It seems like there's a very high touch sort of complexity part of that experience. Yet, as a small growing brand, you also advocate that or recommend you should probably lean on a 3PL, right? So how do you weigh those two like positions together? Like maybe how do you manage it at Herbivore?
Yes, and actually that's a great question because that brings into play actual 3PL selection. And of course, when you go through a 3PL selection, you want to engage multiple players. And a big part of that for smaller brands is to really understand their flexibility and agility to really meet your customer expectations. When you look at the big guys, like there's the largest in the world is Geodis, who operate in this country as Geodis OHL, which is the domestic company they bought. They're a little more structured. They're very structured. It's really difficult to get a highly customized solution from them because they tend to be the big guys that, in fact, they won't even in many cases take on smaller customers just because they don't want the risk of smaller customers either going under or leaving in a short time. But there's a lot of smaller ones that offer a higher degree of flexibility and will customize to some extent to get you that. So I think when you start to identify potential 3PL providers and you interview them and you look at their product offering, that you really make that an important consideration. Now, it'll probably cost you a little bit more. Like when you get the pricing from them, they're going to increase their pricing model based on, during the pack out process. If you want some kind of custom pack out, it's going to cost more labor. And frankly, it's going to cost you more in supply costs too, depending upon how sophisticated, like retailers. I don't know if anyone on the call is ever like, when you buy from Sephora, you're getting a really fancy presentation. I mean, you're getting all kinds of added materials, like bags, branded bags that this product is put in, and all kinds of glitter and marketing materials. Even Ralph Lauren, you're going to get a great, the great box, the tissue, everything is about presentation. So those are, but those really bring added costs. So if you look at getting something that is, and of course, marketing people will quite often want that because marketing people aren't as close to the cost. I don't want to insult any marketing people that may be on the call, but yeah, those are factors that certainly come into play. And but it's costs more, along with the added labor to actually accomplish that highly custom. But that should be an important part of any 3PL selection, is to understand their willingness and their capabilities to really do that for you.
Okay. What other things would you really vet for? And what questions would you ask to really get to that heart of the to what you need?
Yeah, it's just important to understand, each 3PL as far as, how big are they? How much space do they have? How much, increased capacity can they bring? Because a lot of them you'll join and then come to find out a year later that, okay, we're out of space in this building, so we'll have to move you to another building, which any move you ever do is really disruptive. So it's important that they put together where they'll be in next year and the year after. And of course, touring facilities is a critical part of that whole thing, where they can actually walk you to the place that they will do your work and meet some of the team members and that sort of thing. Now, if you do it yourself, I mean, the challenges there are, space. How do you warehouse your inventory? Are you going to buy racking? And then all of a sudden you have to buy, forklifts or material handling type equipment, which can get expensive. And then how much automation do you use? And of course, all of a sudden you're going to need a WMS system. And then some of those aren't cheap. Now they have a lot of really nice cloud-based introductory WMS systems, I'll call them, that are out there that are great to use. So and actually we're using one now called SwiftCount. It's actually very impressive and it's cheap. It's just a few $100s a month and you're up and running with a WMS system where you can move your inventory, scan your inventory, and move it around and that sort of thing. But the degree of automation, and automation, when I say it, can be simple, like conveyors, either gravity conveyors or other types of conveyors. Do you pick your orders in carts or do you pick to a conveyor? And what kind of methodology do you use, like pick to light, pick to voice, all those various methodologies and actually processing. Then your pack out stations, how is that done? Your shipping stations, and a lot of this is determined upon volume. But when you do your own facility, it can get pretty complicated, to have to make those decisions. And I always encourage people to engage like some engineers from a consulting firm to kind of help with design, because they're really smart about drawing it out, telling you what it'll cost. And so, yeah, never be afraid to use, and there's a lot of great consulting firms out there that specialize just in that type of thing, as far as facility design, layout, and so on. And of course, they can always do it in phases too. They'll do like, hey, this is kind of a low automation solution. Here's a higher automation, and then this is the highest automation, and of course, all the associated costs with that. So those are all the factors that come into play when you decide to do it yourself, especially on like a lease. How long of a lease? sign up for.
Yeah. We had a question come in. It said they would love to hear more about the trade-offs of outsourcing to a 3PL. So you mentioned earlier on just like the complexity, right? Especially if you want to do a lot of the custom work, high touch. What other considerations would you think about that would maybe sway you like away from a 3PL?
A lot of 3PLs are, again, since they try to be, one size fits all type of solution. If there's changes in your business, either you're adding channels or maybe you're adding integrations. See, with 3PLs, you're integrating to whatever you have is critically important. In fact, it's the most important thing during an actual 3PL implementation is integrating. Like if you're running, Shopify Plus, or you're running EDI transactions through SPS or through any of the other EDI service providers, if you're running it through your own ERP system, your own order management system, those integrations are really critical. And a downside with 3PLs is it's not easy to do integrations and they're really expensive. So if you go live, let's say with Shopify, you're doing direct to consumer, all your orders come in through Shopify. That's pretty easy. That's a pretty easy integration. Most of them will charge you probably, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 maybe to do a combination of integration and warehouse setup. So you could be up and running with that. If there's more channels, then it gets a lot more expensive and can even go as high as $100,000 implementation to do the full integration, the full setup if you're omni-channel or multi-channel. Mm-hmm. So it's expensive, but unfortunately, once you're up and running, if you want to add on either new customers, new channels, new countries, new geographies, whatever it is, it's a very slow process to add on those new channels, and it's very expensive. So that's kind of a downside with 3PLs. They, they'll obviously do the work, but they're often very slow at doing it. Like we're onboarding Kohl's right now, and that's really a pretty simple EDI type of solution, but it's taken our 3PL, a considerable amount of time. It's taken it's going to take 4 months to get them onboarded. So it's a very slow process.
Does anybody else have questions around the trade-offs between doing it in-house versus like finding a 3PL? We had some questions around, coming in either high touch products or high-sku products, like sort of common complexities to a business. And so, especially when it comes to a high touch product, how would you do or operationalize that differently? What are some of the things that you would make sure that you maybe think about, maybe on the labor side, especially since or I guess more just do you do it in-house versus externally? And then if you were to do it externally, would it be full on operations or maybe just your temp labor on the labor side of things?
Yeah, if your order model, like the way your orders come in is kind of complicated or there is a level of complexity, it's quite often a lot easier to do it yourself. And I currently find myself in that situation. We have our large wholesale customers like Sephora and Nordstrom, Anthropologie, and Kohl's, that their orders are pretty straightforward. They're EDI orders. They drop in. Our 3PL packs them out. They send ASNs, and pretty much everything is done. But then we also bring wholesale orders through Shopify and through other methods, and that adds a level of complexity, especially in the integration. So we've decided to do that ourselves because it is a very high touch process, and our people are so good at being able to pick, pack, and meet all the customer requirements. I mean, we have customers in Europe and even here that require all kinds of value-added services, like applying their price stickers or putting it in bags for e-commerce, Ziploc bags, or applying special UPC codes and that sort of thing. Those value-added services are a lot of times for 3PLs at a level of complexity that unfortunately they just never get right. There's always, and you'll hear a lot of errors from your customers saying, hey, we got product in that was either the carton size was wrong, it wasn't labeled, and when you start having 3PL customer issues like that, that's really a bad thing. And it's much easier to control when it's in-house. So right now we have a hybrid model where we outsource our more stable, more less complicated type of customers, and our real complicated in-house customers, like our smaller wholesale accounts like spas and salons and that sort of thing, we do it in-house just because it's the only way we can really get it right.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point of view, because it sounds like it seems like really high value customers too, right? So the risk of not getting it right can be really impactful to your business, and so you're putting the extra investment.
Yeah, and we currently have a factor that we never used to have, and that's social media. I mean,
mm-hmm.
Just like I was talking about the customer experience with plastic or with air pillows or with cartons that are too large or just a variety of factors. Our customers are very vocal, and it's all over social media that, hey, you're using plastic air pillows and here's a picture and it's a horrible experience for your brand. It's not sustainable, even though it is sustainable. Again, the perception is really our reality. So social media, customers can be very vocal and hit a large audience. So yeah, it can be very damaging to the brand if you aren't meeting your customers' needs
mm-hmm.
on a consistent basis.
And what about high-sku businesses? Like, you used to work at Ralph Lauren, I'm sure, with a lot of apparel. It probably adds a complexity, especially if you have multiple warehouse locations or you start to diversify that way. And so what would be some pieces of advice that you would do to help make sure that you can scale without adding too much complexity or inconsistency?
Yeah, adding an increasing SKU base is always challenging from a material handling standpoint. And it really, the number of SKUs, the velocity of those SKUs really dictates the type of storage method you're going to use. Yeah, Ralph Lauren, we had, I think we had over 60,000 SKUs. When you look at a men's dress shirt, when you have neck and sleeve, those are all separate SKUs. So we had a massive number of SKUs, and our average units per SKU were only 4 units, which is hard to believe. But so what that means is you have to have your setup of your DC has to be, you aren't picking from pallets, you're picking from bin units, or your facility has to be laid out to where an order picker can get to all 65,000 SKUs in a fairly efficient way. Because the last thing you want is people walking in your DC. Every time someone has to walk somewhere to do something, you're wasting labor. It's like what you ought to do is have either some level of automation or some type of conveyor system that's bringing the product either to the person who's doing that order or taking the person to the product, and without having walking. I've joined companies where I've overseen their facility, and you'd see people walking. 80% of their day is just walking, which is non-productive time. So we introduced automation to be able to bring the product to the people and not have to have them do that. So those types of things come into consideration if you have a very large SKU base. And of course, you bring up an excellent point. If you're growing and you decide, hey, it really makes sense for us to have 2 facilities, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, to be closer to our customers, and maybe even a third in the Midwest. Well, the minute you split your inventory, you're always going to have inventory in the wrong place. It's just, no matter how good your supply planners are, you're still going to have inventory in the wrong place. And you're going to find that you're having to ship inventory between facilities in order to get the inventory in the right place to fill your orders. So that is something that you really have to keep in mind if you decide to split your inventory, because to split inventory, it always takes more inventory. You have to have more padding or more safety stock to really cover the factor that you've split your inventory and it's in a smaller, ideal solution is, if you could have one distribution center in Nebraska that had all your inventory, it would be a perfect world from an efficiency standpoint, but that's not practical. So that's never really going to happen. But that's an extreme example. But yeah, when you split inventory, it is, and I've done it so many times, and you can never get it exactly right. You try to get good at it. And of course, they have new systems out now that really help with that, called distributed order management systems, which will allow you to distribute orders to where the inventory is. Like, it knows, hey, the optimal solution for this particular order is ship out of LA. but we don't have the inventory. So we'll go ahead and ship from Dallas, even though we know it costs a little bit more to do that. So those are ways that they're mitigating the risk that comes with splitting your inventory.
That makes a lot of sense. So what I heard was, especially if you do have multiple facilities, which seems to be the thing that you have to do, right? Minus the center of the U.S., is to just make sure that your supply is, you just oversupply a little bit, have that padding, use technology that will help like really have a real-time count where everything is at any time. Anything else you would want to add in terms of like what you've learned in terms of maybe how to best allocate across different distribution centers, or how do you plan for it?
Yeah, my years with the Honest Company, we actually had 5 facilities. We had 3 on the East Coast and 2 on the West Coast. And of course, we were multi-channel. And at first, we did have inventory in the wrong place, and we were constantly shipping truckloads back and forth, which is a very expensive consideration. I mean, I joked that we always had product, you know, when you look at warehousing your product, we always had some on Interstate 70 or on Interstate 10 moving back and forth between the places. But yeah, we got better at it as our forecasting got better, you know, as we grew and it got more predictable, and using some of this advanced technology with, you know, order management and so on, we were able to get much better at it. In fact, we would occasionally ship from the wrong facility to fill an order, which is more expensive, but at least you're filling orders and being able. So you definitely want, if you do split, you definitely want to have the backup capability of being able to route orders to the wrong facility, if that, from a geographic standpoint, if that really at least gets you to ship the order, even though it's more expensive.
And I would imagine with the predictability, you're starting to see what is probably more of a popular item, or more popular categories by geo, and you're able to sort of better allocate across with that in mind. Is that something that you guys take into consideration?
Yeah, that's a critical consideration too. Every brand, and I encourage everyone to do this, and of course you're going to work with your sales and marketing team on this, but you really need to take your SKU base and create a hierarchy. Like, you know, everything is 80-20 in the world of operations, meaning 20% of your SKUs deliver 80% of your revenues. So those 20% are probably your most important, and those ought to be your A SKUs. You know, those are your SKUs you never want to be out of stock. You always want to have in the right place, and you're probably going to add some additional safety stock to protect those SKUs. B SKUs are the ones that are okay. They're pretty good, but you know, if we occasionally stock out, it won't be the end of the world. And then you have C SKUs, are where if you stock out, it's not that big of a deal at all, because they're so slow turn, and quite often if you're buying to MOQs, you know, if you buy inventory, sometimes you might be buying a year's worth of supply, because that's just the minimum order quantity for that particular item. So yeah, I encourage everyone to create that SKU hierarchy where you're ranking your SKUs A, B's, and C's, and working with sales and marketing on determining the rules of what does an A SKU mean, as far as, is it never out of stock, or is it out of stock maybe occasionally, you know, those kind of decisions. But yeah, that's critical to really focus on what's important drivers of your business.
That's a great point. We have a few questions come in. I think probably those who build or like manage their fulfillment internally. So like shifting gears more around like like if you're to continue to scale and do it yourself, what are some of the things that they should take into consideration? I think one that's come in, especially in the last week or two, is really more in the current environment. Everybody's talking about how hard it is to hire and retain the labor workforce. And so one person actually wrote, like, what are some of the things that you've been doing like recently to encourage workers to stay working 40 hours a week and like build loyalty? So I think we're kind of feeling it across all fronts right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And frankly, these are things that we've never faced, certainly in my experience, to where, yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but yeah, a lot of people feel like they can make more money staying at home. So it really is hard to get people. And what we have found is, for our own in-house employees, we've actually had to pay more. We've increased. I mean, they talk about a $15 minimum wage, but when you look at the West Coast, we're actually higher than that, just based on the market. You know, it's you know, here I have a workforce. I'm in Seattle right now. I have a workforce in Seattle, but we're paying closer to $17 and $18 to get people. And then we do use temporaries, and in any facility, I encourage people to develop a great relationship with a temp agency or maybe several temp agencies, because, your staffing plan, if you do decide to do it yourself, it's important. I mean, you're obviously going to have peaks and valleys that you have to contend with. And I always encourage facilities to staff with your permanent people at sort of your baseline, what you need day after day to kind of, hit your baseline need. And then for all the peaks that you have, go ahead and augment that with temporaries. Because see, the last thing you want to do is hire people and then lay them off 2 months later and then hire them again 2 months later. So temp agencies provide that flexibility. And temps do tend to be, I mean, they are more expensive in some cases, depends upon your benefit package, but you might have to pay $25 or $26 an hour to get really good, light industrial type temporaries. But when you look at adding that flexibility, and certainly, the cost of replacing employees, laying off employees is really high. So that's a great option. But yeah, it is difficult we've had people leave because they just thought it was, they could make more money staying at home, or at least as much. So yeah, that's a current challenge that I know in certain parts of the country it's getting better, but it's not going to improve anytime soon. So yeah, unfortunately, you have to pay more.
Yeah. And it's right. It's sort of coming right before like typical peak season, right? With a lot of e-commerce businesses. And so I think just more even outside of like this current environment, which is a little bit of an anomaly, like how far advanced are you starting to think about labor planning for like holiday peak, for instance? And what are some of the things that you do to make sure that you are able to be really prepared by the time that happens?
Yeah, if you're augmenting with temporaries, it's important to have those discussions now, because we're already doing that, and to really understand how many people they can get, and that's where sometimes you'll want to have multiple, where sometimes you can leverage them to get better pricing and that sort of thing. But yeah, you want to make sure, like if your peak means we have to add 60 people to our facility to hit our peak need, then you better start finding out, where can I get those 60 people now and not wait at the last minute, because you got to remember your peak probably aligns with a lot of the rest of the industry. And I mean, I've for many years being in apparel, in fourth quarter, it just goes gangbusters. And there's large retail companies that will hire 3,000 people during, like Gap, back in the old Gap days, they would bring on 5,000 people during peak period. And if you're a little guy down the street from a Gap facility, it's like, guess what? You can't find anyone because Gap's already got them all. So yeah, it's important that you pre-plan for peak. And, now is probably not too late to start planning for that and finding where you're going to get the peak people you need. And again, now you may hire seasonal. If you hire seasonal folks, for 3 or 4 months, a lot of companies do that. You tell them up front, okay, yeah, you're going to be an employee, but you're a seasonal employee, and you're probably going to be, laid off in January when things come to a halt. But so there's different ways of doing that. But yeah, it's important to plan for that.
Yeah. Well, how do you think about, especially as you're scaling and doing it in-house, how do you think about more of your supervisorial or managerial roles? What are some of the things that you look at to decide whether or not it's time to add a new headcount? And what are some of the, and I guess how do you start to like resource plan for the different parts of your business?
Yes, as you grow, that's always a consideration as your management team, and be that, you might have like a manager and maybe a supervisor. Well, as you grow, a manager can leverage more supervisors. So maybe you would add, more supervisors, especially in specialized areas. Like if you have an area where you're doing kitting or some type of value-added service, you may add a supervisor to oversee that function. And then you kind of specialize to where, okay, now you have a shipping supervisor, you have a receiving supervisor, you have a warehousing supervisor, and then you kind of distribute your managers over. Maybe you split your building into two, where you have an inbound manager and an outbound manager who owns those functions underneath them. And of course, there's always support functions with WMS systems and OMS systems and conveyor systems. So you may have supervisors that oversee that part. And of course, inventory control is always an important part of every facility, along with quality. You want to have a quality team or maybe a transportation team. So Yeah, it's important that you design your org to not only meet your current needs, but how can you easily expand your org without having to redo everything and move
Hmm.
people around? And certainly, your employees want to see growth opportunities. So if you're growing, the way to keep them engaged is for them to know that, hey, if I do a great job, I can actually become a supervisor and a manager. I see the path. I see that other people in my situation have done it. So those are important considerations too.
Yeah. So it sounds like first it's just coverage, right? Different types of skill sets with the
Right.
different parts of the business. And then there might be some like either shift or building considerations so that you have physical coverage as well. Once you start getting to a size where maybe you have to add on maybe additional like incremental folks, do you have like a ratio or a rule of thumb that you sort of say like, okay, now this manager is probably like tapped out. We kind of really need to add another person. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a tough one in that it depends on the level of complexity. One supervisor could oversee, 50 people if they're all doing the exact same type of work in a, maybe an automated, solution to that respect.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it kind of depends on the level of complexity and, and as individuals get more specialized, then yeah, you need to distribute your leadership team across the bigger group of functionality and even have the supervisor specialize in that particular area to where they're not generalist anymore. They're a supervisor oversees the receiving function, which can be very complicated, and shipping, and order picking can be, very complicated depending on your methodology for picking. So yeah,
Got it.
it's hard to really say, but it would depend on your level of complexity and so on.
Got it. We have about 5 minutes, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Does anybody have any questions that they want to throw out to Bill?
I guess I covered everything.
You do? Well, if you guys still want to think about it, I have one more. I love asking just like general leadership questions because like you've been, in the supply chain and operations world for a really long time. I guess like one, now that you can like look back, what advice would you give like a younger and greener, more hopeful Bill, so that he wouldn't maybe make as many of the mistakes that you sort of said that you did in your journey?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually pretty easy. I think, we in operations, supply chain, distribution, any of those functional areas, what we do can be pretty technical. And to people in sales, marketing, finance, they look at it like, oh, that's just kind of black box stuff. We don't really know what goes on in there, but we know how much it costs. We know the service. We measure operations and distribution in a variety of ways. So we constantly measuring performance, but we really don't understand how things work because a lot of those groups don't manage large teams. And in fact, in operations, we're really in the people business. It's all about people and building good teams, good high performance teams, because that at the end of the day, if you're in operations and you're not a people person or you're not interested in the people aspect, then you're probably in the, you need to move over to sales or marketing probably because it's or finance. But yeah, it is and for me, the big thing is to do as much education as you can with sales and marketing and finance, because you need at times where you're in a crunch and you're having to add headcount to your budget to meet a service need, you need to educate that our existing team can only do so much. Our units per hour are given this, and we have now an increased need. So finance, we're going to have to bring on 2 people, and here's the specific reason why. And if you educate sales and marketing on how your facility works and the challenges, that'll go a long way at getting alignment during those critical periods where you're having challenges and so on. In fact, I always encourage, figure out a way to get your sales, marketing, and finance inside your building to watch when operations are going on. Walk them through it. Every time I've done that, they've walked out of there like, wow, we had no idea what goes on in a facility like this. It's like a real eye opener. And quite often that's what you need to get, greater support during the tough times, because you will have tough times where they're asking, hey, what's going on? Why didn't the order ship? Why are you behind? Why is it taking 3 days for an order to get processed? They're going to be asking those questions. And if they were in the facility, they would see, okay, I now know why it's taking 3 days. I can see it myself. So yeah, that's important.
That's a great point, especially since you said like a lot of these factors that you need to make require a really strong understanding of their world too and their goals, right? So it's
Yeah,
very aligned.
exactly. Yeah.
We have one question that came in. It's a little bit back to just, how, if you were going to go from in-house to a 3PL, how long should you plan how long would you plan a transition? Or like how long should that transition, should you expect that transition to be?
From the minute you contact a potential 3PL, if it's direct to consumer only, like let's say you're a Shopify direct to consumer, you can probably do it in 4 to 5 months and be up and running, ready to go. If you're selling wholesale channels where maybe you're shipping like EDI, that maybe would add on an additional month. There's added complexity with that, but yeah, you could, in fact, you could probably even do 4 months if you're kind of small. And again, the longest lead time item is always integration. Integrating Shopify to a 3PL, doing all the testing that's required to get that all done. Plus, you have to allow a little time for them to develop pricing, get a contract together, a master services agreement, a statement of work, which that usually takes a month to 45 days. And they aren't really going to do any work until you sign on the dotted line. So you really need that. So about 4 months, which means a month for paperwork, legal review, all that kind of stuff. And then 90 days to actually set up the project, get the work done, and get you up and running.
Great. Well, with that, we're right at noon. So I want to wrap it up by saying thank you, Bill, so much for spending the time with us. I think you gave us really great examples and all of your previous experience. And thanks for everybody for tuning in today. Hope you have a really great rest of your day.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye.
All right. Bye.